Hello and welcome to this installment of Vox Machina. As your narrator, I'll be bringing fantastic works of fiction from the page to your eardrums. Uploads will be posted weekly, so be sure to subscribe and hit the alerts bell to be notified when new installments are available. Got a story you think deserves the Vox Machina treatment? Let me know in a comment and you might just hear it in a future episode. Thanks for listening and on with the show. Hi listeners, this episode will have some not safe for work content, so please listen at your own risk. Thanks! How to Train Your Malfoy by Fencer X. Episode 11. Draco's head shot up, confusion scrawled over his features, and he found himself at just the right height and just the right angle for Harry to lean in and do what Malfoy had been trying to do probably from day one, but what Draco seemed inexplicably terrified to even consider. It was a gentle, testing thing. It generally wasn't polite to kiss someone without their leave, or at least without giving them ample time to demonstrate their generous acceptance of the gesture, or else clock you across the jaw for the cheek. But Harry had been about as polite as he could stomach the past 2.5 months, so if Draco wanted to break his nose again, well, he was welcome to it. Draco did not break his nose again, though. He seemed at first too shocked to do anything but inhale sharply as Harry covered his lips with his own, gently swiping his tongue against the seam of Draco's lips and darting in when he gasped in response. But Draco was sharp, a quick study, always had been, and he seemed to catch on pretty quick what Harry was getting at. And then he had both hands on Harry's jaw, holding him in place as he practically mauled Harry's face, trying and nearly succeeding in inhaling Harry's tongue. There was no shame, or if there was, it had been entirely subsumed by the whip-crack snap of years of restraint finally giving way as Draco allowed himself, for the first time, to demand of Harry everything he wanted. And he wanted, it seemed, rather a lot. He shifted around, drawing his legs under him, and eased up enough he had leverage to start urging Harry down onto his back. Whether a conscious or unconscious effort, he was pretty good at it, and Harry supposed he ought to be. He'd seen Draco pull this move before in the pensive memories, and he did not let this sly maneuver interrupt his frankly breathtaking snogging prowess. Harry had never been kissed senseless, but he worried he was about to be, as all thought and common sense were rapidly being filtered out of his mind in favor of "oh fuck" and "fuck yes" and assorted other oaths of pleasure. There was a deep guttural growl building in Draco's throat, and Harry wondered distantly and dreamily if this was a prelude to a transformation, if he was just going to explode into the dragon right on top of Harry. What a way for his eventual biography to end. Crushed in flagrante delicto with and by a dragon. He wasn't entirely sure how much control Draco had over himself just now, and didn't want to find out the hard way what other sorts of things might trigger a transformation besides mortal peril. Draco seemed lost in the moment, though, and Harry's thoughts were a cloudy, muddled mess as well, such that it was only when Draco arched over him and placed a hand on his chest, pressing him down all the way onto his back, that Harry remembered, oh, right, he had a pretty massive abdominal wound that had only been superficially healed, and Draco had his knee shoved right against it. "Shit!" Harry cried, doubling into a fetal position as a fresh stab of pain wrenched through him, immediately whisking away the fog of arousal that had begun to creep into his mind. Draco jerked back like he'd been slapped, immediately contrite when he realized what had prompted Harry's pained yelp. His face was mottled with altering patches of sheet-white worry and pink arousal. Shit! I'm sorry, I didn't mean... He scrambled back to the other end of the sofa, covering his face as he collapsed back against the opposite arm, quite as far from Harry as it was possible to be without actually leaving the room. Fuck! Harry waited until he could breathe again through the pain and the room stopped its spinning, but he didn't dare sit up, fearful of a wave of pain-induced nausea that would surely overwhelm him if he even thought about it. Through strained gasps, he said, "So definitely not imprinting." "What's your excuse, then?" Draco growled miserably. "Mute half-wits turn you on or something?" He then gave a derisive little snort that snagged in his throat. "Fuck. I don't even know you were bent. I could have retired at 15 sending that to the prophet." Harry didn't know he was bent either. He hadn't really given it enough thought to have an opinion either way. Maybe it was just Draco. Or maybe he had a thing for people who drove him crazy. It might have explained Ginny. Obsessed as you were with me, you'd think you'd have noticed if I was. I wasn't obsessed with you. Trust you to still have an unaccountably high opinion of yourself. And, oh, right. He'd ripped those memories from his mind, hadn't he? That was kind of unfair now that Harry thought about it. How were you supposed to win an argument against someone when they genuinely couldn't remember how very wrong they were? You didn't win, evidently. Harry eased, very, very carefully, back up, supporting himself against the arm of the sofa. My mistake, he said. But if not a childhood obsession, then might I inquire as to what prompted this change of heart? 1, Draco huffed, I believe I told you I was not going to speak about it. And 2, he waved a hand in Harry's direction, you kissed me, not the other way around. A little bit the other way around. He could still feel the searing heat of Draco's fingers along his jaw and around his neck. Did he have bruises? God, he'd never had so much as a love bite, and now he might have bruises on his neck from an amorous encounter. This had been some summer. And don't act like the other you didn't try. I put him off because I'm a gentleman like that, but still. Draco bolted upright, snarling, That was not me. But it was. Harry regretted he couldn't impress his meaning upon Draco with the same physicality, so he had to let his words do the talking for him. That generally didn't work out too well, but it would have to do just this once. Some part of you, at least. Maybe not a part you necessarily wanted to acknowledge, for whatever reason. And maybe not a part you ever would have shared with me, not even at one point. But it felt real. To me. Are you really going to tell me that nothing of him is still in there? A part of you? Draco's features twisted. I told you that wasn't me. You keep saying that, but no, listen to me. You wanted me to talk, so I am. Him, that wasn't me. Whatever he was, whatever you found fond about him, it's gone. He ran a hand through his hair, tousling it. I'm me. The only me I've ever been. Harry lifted a brow. And how do you know what I found fond about him? He snorted softly. You said yourself you didn't even know I was maybe, I'm not sure, bent in school. How do you know what I find appealing at all? I mean, I took Parvati Paddle to the Yule Ball in 4th year and dated Ginny Weasley for like 6 weeks. I defy you to draw any conclusions about my preferences based on my dating history beyond maybe has a thing for Gryffindor women. He paused, raking his gaze over Draco, who was still drawn in on himself like he was worried if he didn't keep all his limbs to himself, he might be inclined to assault Harry again. And I know you're still you. Draco's upper lip curled into a sneer. I don't think you do, or you wouldn't be... He seemed to struggle with his words. Doing that sort of thing with me. He shook a finger at Harry. We aren't friends. I don't like you. You like me a little. I want to shove my tongue down your throat and rut against you until I can't remember my own name. I don't like you. And Harry's stomach gave another wrenching twist, though this time it was not in the least bit uncomfortable. His heart was beating with an absurd tempo that left him feeling lightheaded. And what if I like you? Then you really are concussed. I'm not him. So you've said, but I don't like him. Draco huffed. You almost kissed him. Hell of a way to show it. And Harry, despite everything, was thrown by the realization of just how much Draco really did remember from his time as Malfoy. Well, technically he almost kissed me. And I did kiss you. He shook his head. You're so hung up on you versus him. Because you are! I was being the operative word, but then you kissed me back, so I think I've made my peace with it. I know who you are. I know what you've done. And I know that you do like me. You're just scared I might like you back. Draco's nose wrinkled in a way Harry definitely did not find endearing at all. And why on earth would that scare me? It was a bold question for someone who'd only moments ago admitted to being a coward. Harry eased up onto his elbows, hardly the most elegant of poses, but he wanted to look Draco in the eye when he said this. Because anyone would be. Once you've finally got something you've always wanted, there's every chance in the world you could lose it. I get it. Draco looked like he wanted to protest that Harry was not something he had always wanted, but instead he shunted his gaze off to the side. Coward, indeed. But this won't work if you can't summon the tiniest shred of faith and let me in. Why on earth would you want it to work? Draco asked, understandably bitter, as Harry had shown zero prior inclination to want anything to do with Draco beyond to kick his ass in Quidditch. Draco, however, had not realized in the past 48 hours that someone had wanted him so badly they'd scrambled their own brains to get rid of the feelings. Finding out you were someone's actual obsession made you view certain past interactions in a new light, and while there were a mountain of issues they would need to address before they could be anything approaching amiable, certain parts of Harry were prepared to set aside those issues in favor of testing their compatibility in other areas first. Because, he said, it's been a few years since I made a bad decision I'll live to regret, and I'm about overdue. And also because that bit about your tongue getting shoved down my throat and rutting against me until you couldn't remember your own name sounded kind of interesting. Draco released a stuttering exhalation, and then in one entirely too smooth motion, and with startling care to avoid kneeing Harry anywhere sensitive, Draco was on him, snaking up and over his chest to cover Harry's mouth with his own. It was not the frenetic meeting of bodies from only moments earlier. It had a purpose and a dark, driving intent. Draco swallowed every little sound he drew from Harry, who could not help remembering the wayward Oliver Fontaine and his schoolboy crush on someone who had only used him to fill a need. It felt like a need again now, and Harry had no intention of being another Oliver, here only to fail to live up to whatever fantasy Draco had nursed all these long years. He drew back, pressing himself further into the sofa cushions, and placed his hands on Draco's shoulders. Their foreheads rested together, a thread of spittle hanging between them as they huffed and puffed open-mouthed. "Don't obliviate me," he said, soft and desperate. "What?" Draco asked, lacy white brows knitting together in bold confusion. "What?" "Just promise you won't. Please." And whether because he had matured in the years since his liaisons with Oliver and his ilk, or because he'd simply forgotten how to obliviate someone, Draco cocked his head to the side and whispered against Harry's lips, "Trust the only way you'll be forgetting this is through massive brain damage. Let's hope you don't have a concussion." With one hand, he cradled Harry's jaw, tipping it up at just the right angle so Harry wasn't risking a neck cramp from the strain as they kissed. With his other, he reached between them and gently, so gently, overly conscious now of Harry's stomach wound, but clearly not concerned enough he was going to stop, which Harry was all right with for now at least, eased Harry's legs apart enough he could comfortably settle between them. Harry didn't think he'd ever felt so exposed, even though they were both still in their bottoms, and if they kept up this tempo, there was shortly going to be little left to the imagination. Boxers, in Harry's case, or no, in Draco's. "Hex me if I hurt you," Draco breathed, lips brushing Harry's own as he spoke. Harry did not remind him that things hadn't worked out so well for Draco the last time he'd done that. He tucked one hand under Harry's thigh, holding it out of the way so he didn't jostle Harry too badly, and as he dipped his tongue into Harry's mouth, suckling on Harry's top lip for only a moment before diving back in, he executed a slow, purposeful roll of his hips. He'd angled himself and Harry just so, and Harry gave an audible choking gasp, back arching off the cushions when he felt it, the warm, heavy length of Draco's shaft filling his trousers and nestled snugly against Harry's as he drew it up and up and up, forward until their bollocks brushed. He held there until Harry collapsed back, and then he drew back down, and Harry had to experience it all again, but in reverse. He repeated the movement a second time, and then a third, and then a fourth, and that was about when Harry lost count, prick gone hard as a rock and nerves on fire as Draco pushed him to the edge before drawing him back down. The thin material of their trousers wasn't much, but it was enough to make Harry wish it weren't there, and he caught himself groping for his wand until Draco noticed and stayed his hand. "I told you to hex me if I was hurting you," he panted. "Not if I'm not getting you off quick enough for your satisfaction." "Same fucking difference." "Oh, I beg to differ, Potter." And fuck, the sound of his name, that name on those lips, but for him this time, and not for Oliver or the Bulgarian minister's son or the stocker at Mulpepper's or anyone else. He brought his arms up around Draco's neck and drew him close. Draco's irises were wide and dark, nearly deep enough to swallow Harry whole. "Maybe beg some more and I'll get off quicker," he breathed against Draco's lips, and Draco whispered an oath under his breath and pressed his hips against Harry's, hard, crushing their mouths together. Gone was the slow, tantric rocking of hips. Draco still took great care to ensure he didn't undo all the hard work he'd done mending Harry's wound, but he finally gave himself over to his own pleasure instead of drawing out the encounter just to see Harry squirm. Harry just held on for dear life, all thought and sensation boiling down to his own prick and Draco's and the thin, rough fabric between them as friction and heat and pressure brought them closer and closer to the edge. He could feel a wet spot forming between them, though it was unclear if it was his slick or Draco's, or maybe both their pricks leaking and weeping and begging to be taken over that glorious peak. Draco was grunting roughly into his mouth, sharp, barking groans that sounded just animalistic enough to make Harry wonder if there wasn't a little bit of Malfoy still in there, stalking the dark corners of Draco's mind, hungry and desperate to have Harry all to himself. Harry didn't expect Draco to be much more inclined to share than Malfoy, but at least he might hide it better. Then again, 7 years of being a pissy, moody little shitstain who thought the way to a man's heart was through humiliating him and his friends and touting a fanatic's racist agenda said otherwise. And then Draco shifted, just a hair pressing their pricks together from root to tip, and Draco rocked with whole-body motions against Harry. He pulled back, spine arched into a beautiful curve, and clutched the back of the sofa with one white-knuckled hand while the other grabbed both their pricks through the thin material of their bottoms and began pumping. He thrust his hips in time with Draco's gentle massaging squeezes, and Harry saw stars, head snapping back and slamming against the arm of the sofa. The shock of the impact demolished what little restraint he'd been able to cobble together, and his hips gave a wobbling shudder against Draco's as he released a strangled, grunting cry. He could feel his prick twitching, still trapped in Draco's grip, and Draco continued to ride him mercilessly, and now with mounting urgency. Harry lay there and let it happen, blissed out and bleary until at some point, between the orgasm and possible concussion, he'd lost all concept of time. Draco, too, shuddered atop him and spilled into his own trousers with a final grunting groan. They lay together, boneless and trembling, for several long moments, the space between them filled now with only panting huffs and keening whimpers. Nothing hurt just now, but Harry knew it was coming, and it'd be worse than before. He wanted to just pass out. You couldn't feel like you'd just been sliced in half if you were unconscious, after all, and he was all right leaving all his internal bleeding for tomorrow Harry to deal with. At length, Draco shuffled off of Harry, collapsing back against the opposite arm of the sofa, with legs splayed scandalously wide. Harry kind of wanted to take a peek. He'd always tried to keep his eyes averted when he'd bathed Malfoy or helped him change clothes, but he felt entitled to an appreciative appraisal now. Pricks had never really interested him much beyond pubertal curiosity, and that had mostly been directed at his own, but this one was attached to Draco, and that changed things a bit. He wondered if he'd be allowed to touch it eventually, see all the ways Draco twitched and twisted when he did so. That certainly didn't take long. Draco rasped, a gruff, sneering chuckle catching in his throat, and Harry could feel those sharp grey eyes crawl over him. And here I was expecting a bit more of a show from our vaunted saviour. Harry tried to show him a couple of fingers, but his arms were presently devoid of any bone, so it didn't really work. It's been a while. Cut me some slack. Couldn't exactly nip off to the loo for a quick wank when someone wouldn't give me an ounce of privacy. I'll have you know I haven't had my cock touched in... What year is it? 2002? Draco stared up at the ceiling, not bothering to finish his sentence, and Harry supposed that meant he was in no position to be complaining about lengthy spans between orgasms. A chill began to settle in, mostly on account of his wet boxers, and Harry reached for Draco's wand on the table. If Draco objected to this, he didn't bother speaking up, so Harry was going to assume it was all right. He cast a quick freshening charm over his midsection, then pointed to the sofa and expanded its dimensions to something a bit more suitable for two nearly grown men. One way or another, it seemed, he was going to be sharing a bed with Draco Malfoy, so he decided to just accept it and move on with his life. Draco snatched his wand back from Harry once he'd finished adjusting the sofa, casting his own freshening charm before placing his wand back on the table, this time well outside of Harry's easy reach. There was no pillow barrier tonight. It seemed silly after what they'd just done, and besides that, it was unnecessary, as Draco did not seem nearly as inclined to cuddle with Harry as Malfoy had been. Still, Draco did draw up close beside him, his form a comfortable warmth sharing Harry's pillow. Without his glasses, it was impossible to make out Draco as more than the faintest of outlines in the wan moonlight filtering in through the curtained windows, but he could tell that Draco was watching him, still and quiet. "We should probably talk about this at some point," Harry said, voice soft and rumbly with drowsiness. "Or we could just keep doing this and never fuck it up with things like sharing and feelings. I don't know about you, but that sounds like the option that leads to more orgasms, so it's got my vote." "Hey, mine might lead to orgasms too, you know." He took a long, deep breath, exhaling slowly and trying to relax all the muscles in his body as he did so. "I liked it." He couldn't really see it, but he was pretty sure Draco was rolling his eyes. "Of course you did. I'm fantastic at it." And now Harry was rolling his eyes. "How did I ever manage to forget how humble you are? Modesty, thy name is Malfoy." "And what have I got to be modest about? Pride is right there in my house motto." "Yeah," Harry said, and then, risking no more of the aforementioned orgasms, he added, "So's self-preservation." Draco's voice was icy. "And what is that supposed to mean?" "It means..." Harry eased up onto one elbow. "It means I do think we should talk about it. Doesn't have to be now. In fact, I'd very much like it to not be now. But I'm not done listening to you yet, and I think you still have a lot to say. I'd like to hear it." Draco shifted upright, drawing his legs to his chest and wrapping his arms around them. He stared ahead into the darkness at nothing. Harry despaired he'd overstepped his boundaries. They weren't friends, as Draco said, and they weren't nearly close enough, orgasms notwithstanding, to be having this sort of conversation. Not for someone like Draco, who even within the confines of his own mind kept himself locked away behind a nearly, only nearly, impenetrable shell. But at length he finally said, "I'm mature. I well know it. You've just keenly demonstrated you'd rather take what you want instead of waiting to be offered it freely by very generous parties. You'll lose what precious little patience you might have kindled for me. I won't be worth the effort." He shook his head. "You've seen me on my very best behavior. I'm no prize." "I know." And he could hear Draco frowning down at him. "You're supposed to say something like, 'Oh, that's not true.' It's very rude to agree with me when I'm busy self-flagellating, you know." "Well, are you going to make a habit of self-flagellating?" "Good gad, it's like you don't know me at all." And Harry had to laugh, mostly because he was still feeling a bit lightheaded from the twin assaults of orgasm and blood loss. He squinted through the darkness at Draco, knocking their knees together. "Why not let me decide if you're worth the effort or not? Because you've a habit of making terrible decisions. I believe you said so yourself. You can't be trusted." "Oh, right, I suppose you've got a point, but..." He sighed. "There are some risks worth taking. It doesn't always have to be the easy way out." And before Draco could take it in entirely the wrong way, he added, "I'm no prize myself. I think the fact that I've only ever dated Parvati and Jenny in 22 years upon this earth ought to prove that. I'm the saviour of the wizarding world. I ought to be drowning in my preferred brand of genitalia." There was a heavy silence, and then, "Just because few have bothered to appreciate you doesn't mean you're no prize." Advice taken and returned. He reached across the pillow, playing with the hem of Draco's jersey. He was never going to be able to wear it again now, not without thinking of Draco in it. "Do you at least imagine I can make you happy?" It was a fair question, he thought. After all the misery he'd brought Draco, intentionally and otherwise, it wouldn't be right to make this all about his impulsive desires while ignoring Draco's own thoughts and feelings. Ignoring Draco's own thoughts and feelings was what had gotten them into this predicament in the first place. "Gods, no," Draco laughed without an ounce of good humour. "But I've turned self-destruction into an art form, so why should I let that stop me from doing anything?" "Draco," Harry said, leaning into his face. "I'm listening." Draco swallowed thickly, throat bobbing, and when he inhaled it came out with a little gasp. "I honestly don't know. I'm terrified you'll break me, or end me some other way. But
for whatever reason, I can't not want to be with you. To stand in your orbit. God help me, I've tried.
And Harry knew, perhaps more than Draco, how true that was. He reached for Draco's hand, drawing it to his lips and inhaling his scent. He still smelled like the garden, loamy and fresh. They both of them needed baths.
If I break you, I promise I'll help put you back together and you'll be stronger for it.
He smiled as he kissed Draco's knuckles.
I'm good at that sort of thing.
Fuck you, Potter. Draco twisted, pulling his arm away and rolling over so he was nearly straddling Harry. He leaned down to capture Harry's lips again, wringing a rough, heated kiss from him that nearly drew him up and off the sofa/bed, and they did not manage to fall asleep for quite a while.